right, Brooke, afternoon. How's it going?
Conrad, welcome. So today is the Friday right before, as we're recording this, right before Memorial Day. So any big plans for you for Memorial Day weekend?
No. I know we were joking about this before we hit record about there is a sport bike week occurring here right now in the North Myrtle Beach area, and people just kind of act a little foolish. We'll leave it at that around this time. So we tend to stick to things that we know, like my mother-in-law's backyard, where there's no there's no additional traffic or anything like that, and maybe that'll be a fun thing. But for us, it's more of a lay low kind of holiday. What are things happening up there in your neck of the woods for you?
Yeah, we don't have too many plans. We have my daughter's birthday was just the other day, so we're gonna have a little birthday party for her here. We're all gonna be dressing up like barefoot Contessa. Ina, and that's what she asked for, and she's going to be cooking and baking, so it'll be fun. You get to see me dressed up like her, which will be interesting. I'll make sure I'll share some pictures and get blackmailed later with that. So
it's always a good thing to have some ammo to bring back to you when necessary. So
yeah.
your
Hey,
your honesty, your spirit is appreciated.
I have a cool story, and I've shared this the last 2 years on Memorial Day, and I'm going to share it again. So. About 3 or 4 years ago, I went out for a run. This is when I actually could run. I was training for triathlons and things like that. And at the end of our community is a cemetery, real old cemetery. I mean, there's gravestones back from 1700s. It's really cool. And I don't know what happened. It was dusk, and all of a sudden, this one, and again, it was on Memorial Day. I'm out for a run. It was dusk, and this one tombstone was just glowing white. I mean, it was almost like a light was on it, and it stopped me in my tracks. And I've ran by this cemetery hundreds of times, and I stopped in my tracks. I walked over to it, and I looked, and the guy there died in World War II. Like, it was obvious that from the date of it. And again, this is Memorial Day. And then I looked at his birthday. He had the same birthday as me. And it was just one of those, gave me absolute chills. And it's so weird because I ran by that tombstone 1,000 times. And why did I stop on that day? Why that tombstone? Why was it glowing? This white glow. And it was kind of a weird thing. So I share that story every Memorial Day. So I'll be sharing that again this year on LinkedIn. And I just thought it was kind of a cool story, and just kind of remember our fallen soldiers that have gone on, before us. So.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, maybe there's some cosmic connection there, as you were, like a lost brother or cousin or something in that respect. Maybe, who knows?
So cool.
Okay,
let's do it. Well, we got an exciting guest today.
We do. Dawn, welcome. Excited to have you here with us today. We always like to start with kind of two questions. We kind of typically start in this way. One, how'd you get connected with Brooke, or how'd you kind of meet Brooke on his side of things? And then two, we always like a little background about the guest and kind of your space in the vacation rental world and what you're focused on today. So you can start with either one, but those are kind of our two questions to get us started.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. My name is Dawn Huff, and I got started in this business back in 2003 when I started a company called Miss Kitty's Fishing Getaways. And Miss Kitty's is a property management company that manages waterfront vacation rentals set up for fishing. They have private fishing piers, boat docks, boat ramps, that kind of thing. And back in 2008, I decided to throw away my pen and paper reservation system and sign on with a PMS system, and that was LiveRes. And I actually used LiveRes all the way through 2019 when I sold my company, or I sold in 2022. But I was invited to be on the first advisory board with LiveRes. I was their 53rd client, and I thought I was pretty important. Here I was, this little nobody with a small management company. They asked if I would be on their advisory board, flew me up to Boise, and maybe we went to Sun Valley that time. I can't remember, but that's where I met Brooke, because he was serving on that same advisory board as well. So we go way back to, I think that was 2009, 2010 when we were on the advisory board together. And just fast forward, I sold my company in 2022, so I've been semi-retired for the last 3 years.
There you go.
I was look back on that that first advisory board and think about who was on that group, right? We had Justin Ford, Jim Kitts, Steve Trover, Sharon Keefe, Like, I mean, it was just Mark Tolan. Like, it was such a great group, and I'm sure I'm missing out some people that are going to give me a hard time for it. But like, what a great! I mean, and like those friendships have lasted like so long. So the kind of the vision that the Live Res team had to kind of pull those people together in those early days was pretty cool. And I know like many of my best friends, I know when I actually ended up working for Live Res, I facilitated 3 or 4 different masterminds or advisory boards, and became very close with so many of those people. So it's amazing how pulling people together like that, how magical that really is.
It really is. In fact, I recently attended the VR Nation, and I think I saw every one of those people you mentioned, except for Jim Kitts wasn't there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yep, and lifelong friends.
Yeah. I still remember going out Sun Valley. It was a perfect day, and we were skiing. And then, like, all of a sudden, we came back after a run. And I see everybody at the bottom of the hill at the bar. They're outside, just having. I mean, it's like a bluebird day. It was just perfect, and it was just a magical experience. Out there in Sun Valley and that kind of a time frame. So,
Yeah,
like I said, lifelong friends from that first advisory board.
yeah, absolutely.
Dawn, you mentioned the very tail end of your update there, talking about kind of your story that you sold and you've been semi-retired for 3 years. Do you have any involvement in the business at all anymore? Do you have any like real estate still in the program or anything like that? Or is it kind of in your rearview mirror at this point?
Yeah, not anymore. I mean, I live in the same town with the company still, so I hear things that are going on. It's still Miss Kitty's, but they changed the name to Miss Kitty's Vintory Experience. Um, I think there's only one of my old employees that's still working for the company, so that's kind of a big switch. I do still own 2 properties that were with V-Trips up until the end of last year, and then now I'm self managing those myself.
Mm-hmm. Right
How
on.
many properties when you sold did you have?
155 when we sold.
Wow, nice.
Well, cool. Well, Don, I think your experience and the mistakes that you wrote up are very relevant, and I think a lot of people are trying to achieve what you achieved, which is about basically getting the business in a spot where it can be sold, and then you can, move on to that next stage or that next
Mhm.
project or whatever the case may be. And we've had some folks on, previous episodes that have done that have sold their companies, and have learned a lot, during that process. So I think that people can learn from your mistakes maybe, and hopefully make smooth over some of their rough spots and not make them. Then they can get to where you got. And potentially have that type of financial success that hopefully came with the sale. So if you're comfortable, we'll dive right in here, starting with number 1. So number 1, you talked about sometimes small businesses grow and longtime employees end up in leadership roles just over time because they know things and they have longevity, they have knowledge of the company. Maybe they weren't necessarily natural born leaders. So as you kind of scaled and maybe your team got a little bit more seasoned, you put maybe some folks in leadership roles based on what you're understanding here. But you realized that maybe over time they weren't exactly leaders. So what was the change that you made in the business before you sold it to put leaders in leadership roles? And how did you, if needed, move people into spots that were a better fit for them in that process?
Right, sure. And I think this is a pretty common issue with small businesses because you start off small, you're doing everything yourself, and then maybe you start hiring people. And in my case, I hired a lady early on who initially started off just answering phones, but eventually she was helping with owner statements, dealing with homeowners, just started doing many different things with the company. And she was with me for a number of years and really knew all the ins and outs of my business. She was a very good employee, very reliable, um, and she naturally fell into the manager role because she knew so much about the business. The problem was she wasn't a very strong leader. And when you're a manager, you need to be a strong leader. She was more of she was a good coworker. She wanted to be friends with everybody. She was nice. And I needed somebody that was going to take control and reprimand people if they needed to be and that kind of thing. So I was in a difficult position because I really felt that I couldn't run the business without her. And I think that's the trap that business owners get into. They think that this one person is so invaluable that if you get rid of them, that your company just can't survive. In my case, I saw the position that I was in for too long, a number of years. I knew I needed to make a change. But when I tried to bring somebody in more of a leadership role, it created conflict between the long-term employee and the person that was supposed to be the leader. So I just obviously didn't find the right person. What ended up happening in my case was that my long-term employee ended up getting fired for something totally unrelated and very unexpected, unfortunate event that happened, but I had to let her go. And so that opened the doorway for me to bring somebody new in. But what I learned is that even though she left unexpectedly, I wasn't preparing for it, the business didn't fall apart. And I brought in somebody that had strong leadership capabilities, but really didn't know the industry. But because she was such a strong person and smart, was able to learn, she jumped in and was able to take over and actually did a much better job in that leadership role than my old time employee did. So, I mean, I think that's where business owners need to learn. Your business is not going to fall apart if you get rid of one key employee. You can train somebody else to do that job and make sure you get somebody that has the right skill set doing the job that they're doing.
Yeah. Yep. That's spot on. I feel like someone always told me they're like, everyone is replaceable, and in the grand scheme of things, like, and Trover talks about this all the time. It's, 36 hours of suck. It's 36 hours where it really, really sucks, and then it all gets better. And very often, the person that you think is irreplaceable, guess what? You bring in somebody else, and they're better than the other person. And again, going back to like the leadership roles though too, and people are probably sick of me talking about these psychometric personality assessments like predictive index and culture index, but those really helped me identify who are the true leaders, like who wants to be leaders, and who are the people that are I don't want to say the followers, but like they're happy being taskmasters, right? They're happy just being a support role, individual contributor. And to me, you can kind of, by seeing that where they naturally fall, you can kind of develop those leaders into leadership roles, assuming they obviously, fulfill and hit their metrics and get the support from the team and things like that.
I think one thing that's very common, though, I'm sure you've seen this as well, Brooke, because some people feel like if they don't get a leadership role, they don't get any additional compensation. They feel like, oh, that's the only path they have to getting, a raise or doing better in the company is like, no matter how good I am at this role, there's a ceiling on it. So I don't know, Brooke, if you have any thoughts on that. And then Dawn, I'm curious your follow up on there. Is there a path towards getting people what they're good at, but also giving them a chance to like increase their success and increase their compensation as well? Or what's kind of your thoughts on that?
I'd love Dawn's opinion on that.
Well,
what's your perspective on
I
that?
always like to move people up from within the company. I mean, I think it's really exciting when you hire somebody to work the front desk, they're answering phones, maybe they're a young person, and you find out that they're maybe good at managing maintenance, and they move into a different role and maybe get an increase in pay. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great idea to do that. And sometimes you'll hire somebody in one role and they're really good at another role. And we hired a lady to answer phones, and she did that for a couple of months. And then she says, I've got a background in the military and I did maintenance for the military, and I really would like to be in the field doing maintenance work for you. And complete switch, moved into that. She was much happier. She was great at it. And we were excited because she was our first female in the maintenance department.
Nice. No, absolutely. It's getting the right people on the bus, right? And then you can find the right seats for them. And very often, I mean, even if I look at my team here at Vintory, we've got about 40 people. Like many of the people that are in the roles they're in now, like they did not start in. We've shifted them around and things like that, and just find it. Even if you think you've got it perfectly set, it ends up, I really like this over here, and you swap and trade, and it's kind of finding that equilibrium, I think, is the right spot. But if you get good people in general, like they can adapt, they can adjust, and you can find them in the right seats eventually.
Right on. Awesome. Well, number 2 kind of builds on that point, Brooke. So I'll kind of come your way down on this one. So number 2 is talking about many business owners try to do it all, and it takes a while to kind of learn how to delegate, how to give to those awesome team members that you are hiring. Hey, I can help with this. Hey, I can help with these pieces. And then maybe the mistake was you learning the balance of how to lead and tell people what to do, but also not micromanage. So what was kind of your journey in that process, Dawn, of eventually deferring and assigning work to those team members, but also not maybe hovering too much and micromanaging too much either?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's a great way to start a business is you start it and you learn all about it yourself. You do everything at once, and that's how you learn your business. I think there's a lot of startups that they don't start that way. they immediately start with the team and try to build a business that's already full blown. So I definitely, appreciate the fact that I started as a one-man show and worked that way for a number of years and in that aspect and wearing all those hats. But that said, as I started growing, I knew that I was going to need help. And in my head, it's like, what jobs do I hire out? And I had a friend and a client who would rent houses for me a lot. Her name was Dixie, and she used to come down from Dallas almost every week because she loved fishing so much. And she would stay at one of my houses, and she became a friend. And she finally said, Dawn, you were too busy. You really need somebody to help you out. She's like, how about if I answer phones for you, and maybe we'll do a little trade out deal, and I'll stay at one of your houses and I'll answer phones for you, that kind of thing. And so I thought about it and I said, all right, yeah, let's give it a try. And this probably would have been, 2000, late 2000s, I guess. And she would come down, she had a cell phone and a tablet, and she would be out on the end of a fishing pier fishing, taking phone calls, doing reservations on the tablet. It was amazing. But in my mind, I thought, how can I give up that face to face with the client? That's my important job here, is I'm talking to the clients. Nobody's going to be able to relate to my customers like I do. But I said, all right, I'll give it a try. You like to fish, and so maybe you can have a good rapport with our customers. And it wasn't 1 week I let her take over the phones, and I came back in and took over one day and answered a phone call. And I'm like, hello, Miss Kitties, this is Dawn. Can I help you? And the guest on the other end says, can I speak to Dixie, please? I'm like, what? That fast? It's only been 1 week. They already don't want to talk to me. They want to talk to Dixie. I mean, it was that fast. And so that was kind of eye-opening to me that, okay, I didn't need to be there answering the phones. She could take over that job. So, and I think because I learned it early on with that job, it was easier for me to give up other tasks that I was doing, because I realized that I was being pulled really thin and I wasn't doing a good job at anything because I was not spending enough time with anything. And so I really started thinking, okay, what jobs can I hire out? And I learned that maybe this person didn't do the job exactly how I would do it, but she got the job done and it was satisfactory. So I tried not to micromanage, let them work the way they work, and allow me the time to do the things that are important for me to do.
Yeah. I think you said a couple key things there that I totally agree with. The first thing is doing it all yourself first. And I did the same thing, because how are you expected to coach? How are you expected to show people how to do it and train them how to do it if you've never done it? And also, I think you just earn a little bit of respect from your team. You know what I mean? If you did kind of roll up your sleeves and do everything, and just, my perspective is just much, much easier. I do remember there was a story of the Marriott family. When they would raise their children, they would actually have them in all parts of the business. They had them like working in the laundry. They had them working at the time they owned Roy Rogers. They had them working there, like, just so they could see what it was like to, be that. So I think you get a lot more respect when you do that. Just a much better perspective too. But you also, what you said there is like just hiring those people and replacing some of those things you do. The greatest way to reduce stress is to hire a rock star. If you hire another rock star that can take some of that off your, shoulders, it is the best way to do it. I mean, it's amazing. Even just in my life personally right now with Vintory, how, like, I can actually go on vacation. I can actually go to a conference and my phone is not blowing up. It's because I've hired these other people to take a lot of this stuff off my back, and I can, focus on what I do best. But yeah, that's hiring key people is so critical to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you got it right there.
You mentioned, Conrad, about being able to sell your business. And one of the things I knew I needed to do to be able to have my business in a good position to sell was for me not to be involved in the day-to-day operations much at all. And so I tried to set things up, especially over the last few years, so that it could completely operate without me there, and hired out all those positions. And then I would just oversee everything. So that was something, actually, I was proud that I was able to do that. I was proud that I was able to step away and watch things operate without me being right in there in the middle of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All I could envision, I think you guys nailed it there. Just one funny commentary that I had there, Dawn, is that honestly, someone who's fishing and like on the dock and then answers the phone is probably like the best salesperson, because they're like, oh, hold on, I got one on right now. And they put the phone down for a second. That's actually going to increase the conversion rate, because they're like, oh, I'm
Yes.
talking to the right people. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like, that's all I could envision there.
That's your ideal customer profile, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, like, they understand exactly what you're
For
going
sure.
after, as it were. So makes sense. All good. Well, let's go over to number 3 then. So we've talked a little bit about team members so far, but obviously this is kind of flipping the page a little bit to that homeowner relationship. So number 3 was maybe being a little afraid to terminate or end that first bad homeowner relationship. You felt bad about it, or maybe there was even some anxiety and panic attack, type feelings going on, Dawn, as you were going through that process. But walk me through it. When you did have to go ahead and make that call and fire that owner, how did that go? How did you find that helped the business, maybe freeing up kind of the bad apple, if you were in the bunch?
Sure. It actually happened fairly early on in my business. And I want to say probably a good percentage of the business owners that you have had on this show, Brooke, have had the same problem. It's a common thing, right? And so you just really have to experience it. And in my case, it was it was 2 homes that I had, and the homeowner lived right in the middle of those 2 houses. So, and there she was, and they were beautiful homes. They were fantastic. I was really excited to have them in my rental pool, which made it harder when the owner was so difficult to deal with. But she was the type of owner that, rather than being excited that there were guests in her house, she was almost annoyed that they were there. They were being too loud. They're being messy. They're cranking up the AC. They left 15 minutes late. Every little thing that they did annoyed them. And so it wasn't a good working relationship right from the beginning. And it just continued. She was very critical of everything that we did, from housekeeping to maintenance to the guests to owner statements, everything. She questioned everything. And I really did feel like I was going to have a panic attack every time I talked to her, because she would just come up with the most outrageous things. But the defining moment for me was, we had a really good customer staying at one of the houses, and I had given him approved a late checkout for him. This customer stayed with us 4 or 5 times a year. Was a great client. And the homeowner called a little after 11 and said, hey, the guests aren't gone. And I said, yeah, I approved a late checkout for them. They're really good customers. I explained to her why we approved the late checkout. She asked if they were paying a late checkout fee. And I said, no, we waived the late checkout fee because these customers come down. They stay multiple times a year. If they like your house, they're going to be back. Well, she didn't like that. And she storms over to the house. I find out later she goes in the house with the guests there and cranked up the AC. And she said, you're not using my electricity if you're not paying for it. Yeah, isn't that crazy? I was horrified, absolutely horrified. So after that, I had to call her back and say, I'm sorry, we're clearly not on the same page with, how we're running these rentals. I think it's time for you to find somebody else to manage your properties. So, but it was never easy. Every time I had to let a homeowner go, which didn't happen that many times. And it didn't always end badly. I have another example of a homeowner who had been with us for many years. But she was very, very critical of everything, and mostly a complainer, not to the extent that the first one was. She certainly didn't interfere with guests and things like that, but she just was never satisfied with anything that anybody did. And it got to be so bad that whenever she called, the staff would just cringe. Nobody wanted to answer the phone when she called, and they would fight over who was going to have to talk to her. And so eventually, after all these years, I called her and I had a conversation. I said, look, Terry, you have been with me a lot of years, but things have gotten so bad that the staff, they work hard. They go in there, they spend all this extra time to make sure your house is absolutely perfect when you come in. And it doesn't matter how hard they work, you will come in, and rather than complimenting on something that maybe looks nice or is done right, you will find that one little crumb that's on the floor, and you will call and you will complain about it. And I said, frankly, nobody wants to talk to you anymore. And so I think maybe it's time that you find, another property management company. Well, she didn't find another property management company. She changed her attitude. And I mean, she didn't become the perfect homeowner, but she was better. She recognized that she liked our services, that we really did do a good job in some areas. And so she started changing her attitude with the staff. So that one worked out well.
Yeah. So that's funny you bring that up, Don. I think we've had like Conrad first off, lots of people have talked about this. I think it's like the most common one by far. But I feel like we've had 3 or 4 people that have mentioned that last example, where they actually said, you know what, like rather than just firing them, they actually had the conversation with them and says, you know what, like nobody on the staff likes you. Nobody likes taking your calls. They stress like you wouldn't believe. They take the stress home. You're causing this, and unless this behavior fixes and changes, and a lot of times they don't even realize it. They don't even realize they're acting like that. So, and they realize that they would lose, you all as a management company. So I feel like the takeaway here is don't just fire owners, like give them the opportunity to get better. Tell them that, look, if this continues, you're going to be gone, and see if it does get better. Cause I bet a percentage of the time, maybe it's a third, maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 25% of these owners will actually fix themselves and actually, stay on board and be respectful.
Yeah, I guess I almost look at it on like a 10-point scale, Brooke. If they're like a 6.5 to an 8.5, maybe I could rein them back in, on the battle and get them to 2 or 3 where we want them to be. If they're a 10, like Dawn's first example there, you got to cut bait and move on, right? Like you can't recover from that, I would say.
That's true. Well, and sometimes you just have owners that they think things are, going to be better with somebody else. The grass is always greener, and they may get out with some other company and realize that they don't have it better there. So sometimes it's good if it's somebody that you can work with and change their attitude, then welcome them back.
Yeah. I heard this one recently, Dawn, which is the grass is not always greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it. So it's like if you work on that relationship and you try to improve it, that can be a really good green grass relationship. If you don't work at it or don't work to make it better, then the grass is all brown and dried out and terrible. So you got to know what to work on.
That's a very Conrad quote right there.
I just pick these things up. I don't come up with very many unique ideas, but it is what it is. No. Well, good. So number 4 is switching maybe lanes here. I would say somewhat aggressively here, Dawn, maybe talking more practically on the operations side. Number 4, you talked about linen service. So when you started your own business, the owners actually did their own linens or own sheets and towels, all those pieces. And then maybe you just did them on the turn. You washed them or cleaned them in property and then got them ready for the next guest. But you kind of gave some advice here. Like if you're doing that today, like that's definitely not a great idea. You want to make sure that you have standardized linens and everything the same, across properties. And perhaps you worked on some processes as the company went along to make that easier to transition and, change out in the listings for your housekeeping staff. So where'd you kind of end up? What was kind of the beginning part? It sounds like you talked about there. Where'd you end up, towards the end of your operation of the company as far as linens and housekeeping?
Yeah, sure. So when I first started this business, the way it was done in my town is laundry was done in the house. Owners provided all their own linens, sheets, towels, everything, and we did laundry in the house. And there were no linen services available, and that's just the way we did it. So from going to conferences, I realized, okay, there are other ways to do this because I knew it was a problem. I mean, it was a problem right from the beginning, right? Owners were always complaining because sheets and towels weren't lasting. They were getting stained. They would disappear, any number of things. So they were always complaining because of the linen loss. We weren't happy because some owners had good linens, some had bad linens, that kind of thing. And then housekeepers hated it because it took forever to do the laundry in the house. So I recognized the need right away for a better system. I just either didn't know how to go about it, was afraid to go about it, make a big change. I just, there are a lot of different things going on in my head, and reflecting back, I'm like, why the hell did it take me so long to actually take the step to go to standardized linen? So that would be my advice to anybody that is still doing it the old school way, or maybe just getting into business is make that switch sooner rather than later. It's only going to continue to cause you problems. And it's much easier to make a switch when you're a small company than when you have a large number of properties. And so for me, by the time I made the switch, I was already managing 100 properties. And rather than taking that jump into a full-blown laundry myself, I was afraid to do that. I ended up hiring a linen service out of Corpus Christi, which is a town about 45 minutes away from Rockport. And I think if it had been a good linen company, things might have ended up differently. But the service that I got from this linen company was not very good. The quality of the linens went down. They never delivered the right amounts. There were just all kinds of problems right from the beginning. And so we were with them for about a year, but it wasn't going very well. I was trying to figure out what we were going to do about it. And then our town got hit by Hurricane Harvey, and my inventory of 100 plus properties went down to 22 overnight that were rentable. And I took that opportunity to start over again, and I started up my own linen service. So I was starting on a small scale, ended up just getting a small washer and dryer, commercial washer and dryer, and kind of grew into it. So at least in my mind, it was a lot easier to do it that way. We had been utilizing the linen service, so we had already kind of figured out how to cover the costs of using a linen service. We just had to figure out the cost of actually doing the laundry itself. So by the time I sold, we actually had an in-house laundry. We had a full-scale laundry going, and we did all our own linens. And by the way, when I did tell the owners that we were switching to standardized linens, there was a pushback from a number of them. Some didn't care. Some were happy about it. But almost instantaneously, everybody was happy with the linen service. They recognized the value of it, how nice it was to have your standardized sheets and towels as long as you provide a good quality. So it just worked out all the way around.
Yeah. I think the big point there that I've heard multiple times, it's so much easier to do things when it's small scale. It's easier to onboard a new software. It's easier to launch, that kind of thing. It's easier to go to, remote locks and things like that. It's so much easier to do in the early days and start it that way rather than changing it later when you're at a larger scale. We've heard that, time and time again. And also, one of the common things we heard was they wish they launched the laundry facility earlier because it became a big profit center. So was your laundry facility, did it turn into a profit center for you?
Well, I tried to make sure everything in my business made profit. I mean, that's the way I run it. I don't want to just break even. I want to be able to, make a little money off of it. Not necessarily a ton of money, but you need to come out ahead. You need to be able to cover those costs and come out ahead a little bit. So I'd say, yes, we did make money off the laundry.
Nice.
Yeah. I think it's a common one, and maybe it's just that initial cost, Brooke, that I think people have mentioned a few times before. It sounds like, Dawn, you were kind of able to scale it up, which in a way it's kind of unfortunate circumstances maybe of why you were able to do that, because you had to almost reset a little bit, it sounds like, with the hurricane happening. But if you go from all right, you're doing 200 properties and you're turning them, it's like, wow, to build a facility of doing this myself, it could be $30, $40, $50,000 worth of equipment plus the real estate if I need to buy more real estate to actually sit this stuff in somewhere. So I think it becomes a big cost. But to your point, Brooke, long term, I see the math working out. But short term, probably doesn't feel that way when you're sending the check to Speed Queen to buy all those high end premium hardware equipment. So
yeah. And there are people out there that you can consult with. And I met with a consultant, and they look at the size of your business and how many pounds of laundry you're doing, how many flips you're doing, and that kind of thing. And they can make recommendations on the size of the washers and dryers that you need and size of facility, recommend layouts for everything so that you don't have to just wing it and do it on your own.
Right on. Awesome. Well, number 5, I would say maybe, Dawn, we did kind of touch on this briefly when we talked about employee kind of delegation and giving people those individual tasks. But number 5, just for the benefit of the listener, was talking about the strengths and weaknesses. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What are your passions and your pain points? I like the way you described that. I think that's a good way to think about it. I know I have those in my business. So anything maybe to add into that idea of as you went along, you found something that maybe you enjoyed a little bit more as you got bigger, and then maybe stuff that you wanted to keep kind of delegating or having other people work on in your business.
Yeah, I think that the big thing is if there's a pain point in your business that is something that you just really hate doing, definitely find somebody else to do it. I mean, there's no way I could have stayed in business if I had to keep dealing with the housekeeping department. That was one of the first things I hired out was a housekeeping supervisor. I'm like, if I have to take one more call from somebody who's unhappy about housekeeping, or if I had to walk into one more house that the beds weren't made right, it was driving me crazy. And so there are people out there that they don't have a problem. They like housekeeping. And in fact, the woman that I hired for that job, she was with me all the way up until I sold the company. Many, many years. She loved the housekeeping, field. And so it was a perfect match. I hated it. She loved it. And, dealt well. So yeah, takeaway there is if there's something that you really don't like, get somebody else to do it and focus on the things that you really enjoy doing.
It reminds me of, there's a word called, it's a Japanese word. It's called, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right, but ikigai, I think. And it translates to reason for being. And it's this kind of like this intersection of, what you love, your passion, what you're good at, your vocation, what the world needs, your mission, and then like, what can you be paid for? So like, if you can find that kind of that Venn diagram and find that sweet spot, like that is the perfect thing. Now, I know I realize I'm trying to live in utopia, but if you can find that, which I feel like I've done here, luckily with, my role, but it's a special place. Mm-hmm. Are you, Conrad, are you doing that? Or did you find a key guy?
Yeah. By the way, I did Google it really quickly. Ikigai. I think you were actually pretty close there. This is the phonetic spelling, if you will, at least according to Google. So if it's wrong, blame Google, not me. For our surely very wide Japanese audience that we have listening today, as it were. But I think certain things, to be honest with you, Brooke, I've been able to find that, but there's certain things I don't like doing. Dawn, you mentioned the housekeeping. For me, that's kind of sometimes some of the invoicing and accounting stuff is never super appealing to me. I understand the reason why it exists and why it's necessary, but doing things like the balancing of the books and, getting all the expenses tagged and categorized, these things are not appealing to me at all. So luckily I have someone that I was able to hire and they enjoy doing that kind of stuff. They find the tedious nature of it very, satisfying or appealing to them. So I'm like, awesome, you do that. And let's talk once a week to make sure it's all on good track. And that's what we do.
That's the funny. So we did the same. I cannot stand the accounting part of this business and like the billing and everything else. And we hired this young lady, AJ, and she loves it. I talked to her just the other day. She's like, Brooke, I love what I do. And that was the part I hated the most of my job. So it's like we traded off the stuff that I hate and gave it to her. And she literally gets enjoyment and fulfillment out of billing and like tracking and everything else, which is, I don't know.
There's something very satisfying about balancing your books and reconciling your bank statements and everything zeroes out perfectly and it's all accounted for. I can understand that. I guess I'm kind of a numbers person myself.
Yeah, that's the thing, I guess, Donna, is I feel like I am a numbers person, but it's, I don't know, there's certain numbers that I like and certain numbers that I just find tedious. So for me, looking at analytics data, I find appealing. I know many people don't, or budgets. Again, I almost don't mind that. When it's more marketing or more creative, I am drawn to it. But when it's the tedium, that's when I kind of lose my brain a little bit. So we all got to find what clicks for us. That's for sure. We'll go. Let's go to number 6, Dawn. Number 6 was waiting too long to set up real business hours. In your words, there, when you were a one-man show or one-woman show, as it were, automating your business so that people have the information they need in order to reduce the after-hour phone calls. So I feel like I've heard this so much over the years, Dawn. This idea of like there's an after-hours phone, and it used to be like a physical phone that you were like given, and it's like, all right, like this gets traded around or whatever the case may be. But I imagine if you're a one-person show, it's like that phone is just your main phone and people are just calling it. So as you were kind of smaller and as you went along, how did you find that right balance as far as hours and when you were being responsive to guests when it was actually legitimately an issue that you needed to resolve through phone or something?
Sure. Well, it's difficult in the beginning. For me, and probably most business owners, you're excited about your business, you're trying to grow it, and you don't want to miss any phone call. You feel like you can't let that phone call go to the next morning. You want to respond right away. And I definitely fell into that. I would take calls all hours of the night to do reservations. And I had a home office. I was working at home. So I felt like, okay, I'm at home, I'm with my family, but you're not really with your family if you're sitting at dinner and you're hopping up to take calls all the time, right? Or if you're trying to read a book with your daughter and phone rings, and you're like, all right, hold on, honey, here, you finish the book by yourself. I got to go do a reservation. I mean, that you're not really there. You're not engaged. And so it got to a point where I had to say, okay, I need to set business hours. I don't have to do reservations at night. I mean, that was one of the things that drove me to get the software. Once, once they came out with softwares that you could do online bookings, that was a big thing. So I thought, okay, I need to find some software that's got live calendars. It takes takes online bookings, and get that set up so that I can guide people for after hours to make reservations that way. And that's how I ended up signing on with LiveRes. I think back then there were maybe two, maybe three choices. I remember Escapia was around LiveRes. I think there was a third one. And at the time I was really thinking, wow, who's going to go online and book with Miss Kitty's Fishing Getaways? They don't know who I am. I'm not a Holiday Inn or a household name that people know. So what's going to give them the confidence to book online with me? But from day one, when we went live, we started doing 50% of our bookings online. I couldn't believe, how eager people were for that kind of thing. So we got the online bookings, we set the business hours, and like you said, I was doing the after hours line for a lot of years. And I actually kept that after hours line pretty much up until I sold the company. And the reason that I did that is it was just kind of the way I could keep an eye on things. And I had already set things up so that the only after hours calls should be true emergencies. Anytime I got a call for something that wasn't a true emergency, I would say, okay, what do I need to do to make sure I don't get this call anymore? I don't want to get a call after hours because they don't have a Wi-Fi password, or because they don't have a lock to the house, or because they don't know how to turn on the fishing lights. All of those things can be handed to the guest ahead of time, whether it's electronically or in a guest book or something like that. I wanted to make sure that the guests had all the information that they needed, so they didn't need to call me for little things like that. And we also set up our phone system, the answering service, so that it would guide people to go to the website if they needed to book after hours, and really to only get through to the after hours line if you were a guest staying in a house and it was an after hours emergency. Otherwise, leave a message and we'll call you back in the morning. So I think because of that, I really had cut down most of the calls that were coming in that weren't urgent. And like I said, if something did come in and it wasn't an emergency, I knew there was a breakdown in the system somewhere. So what did we need to do to make sure that got fixed? And my staff was very aware that I had the after hours line, and they knew that I was not going to be happy the next day if I got a call after hours for something that I shouldn't have. So they were very diligent with making sure that the guests had everything that they needed when they checked in.
Yeah, I remember when we signed up with Rubaru, which I love, big fan of NARS and Rubaru. We went through like the past, what are the most, 25, most popular questions we got. And we just uploaded it into Rubaru. And it was amazing how just that one little software tool solved. And I know there's lots of companies that do this now, but when we implemented that, just how many calls that circumvented. And very often when they would call, you would just, or email, you just send them back to the link to that little, interactive guidebook, and how quickly and easily, it would explain those things. And again, I know there's lots of solutions that do that, but that was a game changer for us that unlocked it.
Love that. Yeah. Well, speaking of maybe process and systems, Dawn, that was kind of your seventh one here. So number 7 was talking about writing SOPs, or standard operating procedures, as kind of they're commonly called. Again, as kind of that one person show for a long time, a lot of those SOP documents were probably up here in your head. You weren't writing them down and actually documenting that. And you tell a story in here about the first time you realized you needed a policy of the first time a gun was left in the house, which I'm sure is a common occurrence in Texas, but maybe you could walk us through that particular example. But how did you eventually make some better documentation for your team as that scaled and you got a little bit bigger?
Yeah, right. I knew before I actually put it into place that I needed to have written procedures. From the time I hired my first employee, you learn it. I would just tell her how to do things, but I was thinking, gosh, if I had an employee book with our standard operating procedures in there, then I could just hand her the book and she could look things up. So I knew I needed to have it in place, but it was one of those things that was a big undertaking. Once you're a full scale business, right? You've got a lot of policies, but like you said, Conrad, they're in your head, and you've got to get those on paper. You've got to write them down. You've got to have an employee manual. You've got to have all those things, and you just have to take the time to do it. So like we've been talking about all along, it's a lot easier to do when you're a small company and maybe they're not all there than when you're a big company. But it's definitely important for standardization within your company that this is the way we do things. But yeah, the gun thing was kind of interesting. You may not realize that you need to have a policy for that, for certain things until an event happens. And then you're like, well, I guess I better write a policy for this. And yeah, in that case, the housekeeper called and she found a pistol in the oven. And she's like, what do I do with this? And so lucky for me, my husband was retired, or he's a retired police officer. So he was able just to go, he went and picked up the gun. We brought it back to the house and we had to contact the guest and have them come pick it up. But after that, we ended up contacting our local police department and met with them and kind of came up with a policy together on how we should handle that when it happens in the future. So we knew what to do. And so, yeah, we wrote a policy for that.
Podcast for everything, or I mean a podcast, a SOP for everything. So it's funny. I think this came up a bunch. So this was, in fact, chapter 3 of the book, Vacation Rental Secrets. Get it at your local Amazon and bookstore. But Jed Stevens, I think, said something to the effect of he wishes he hadn't allowed his employees to be, aimlessly because he didn't provide any kind of structure or guidance in, formalized ways. So exactly what you said, like not giving them, training or SOPs, et cetera. So again, this was a popular enough one that became a whole chapter in the book.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I think that this is a common one. I think it's one of those things too, where it's like you can get away with it for a while, so it's easy to see why you can skip it. Like, like you alluded to there, Dawn, where you can like tell the employee, and then that employee will have it in good shape. But I think what can really get you sometimes too is like that key employee leaves, they leave for another company, another opportunity, they move away, and then it's like, oh man, like all that institutionalized knowledge that they had, it's now a thing. So what I tell my employees now, or my team members, is just like, I don't want this to happen, but if I get hit by a bus or you get hit by a bus tomorrow, like how do we make sure that like things can hopefully continue on, and the client doesn't get screwed over? So I kind of frame it in that way. It's like, we got to take care of the client by doing the SOP. And that sometimes puts people in a better frame of mind to want to, okay, I'll write it down. Okay, I'll do it. And of course, it's always a bit of a process to ask those things, but that's been my experience at least. All right. So Dawn, number 8, you almost kind of ended on a somewhat funny note here in a way, just talking about, I think Brooke did ask for 10, but you made a kind of a joke here at the end, because I think what you shared was fantastic. Don't get me wrong. But number 8 was, don't make the mistake of always conforming to what is the norm. So the norm was 10. And obviously I think you had a punch your list here with 8. And you mentioned here in the notes, I should have finished this list of mistakes for Brooke a few weeks ago. Instead, you got stuck after number 7 and then maybe had a hard time finishing it. I should have submitted it, but instead I put it in the back burner. And now it's a little bit later than Brooke anticipated. So again, kind of a joking thing here at the end, but you made the list that made sense for you. And that it seemed like that's kind of how you operated the business. Maybe just a note here at the end of like, you did what you kind of thought was the best outcome. It ended really well, for you financially, I'm sure, which is an awesome story to hear. But anything else we could tie in here with that mistake, or just broader notes that you learned along the way before we put a bow on this one?
Yeah, sure. And I guess the point I was trying to make is, because I wasn't finishing the task that was at hand, right? I felt bad because I didn't get it submitted. I waited weeks when I should have had it turned into Brooke, and I didn't. And I thought to myself, why am I not getting this done? And part of it was because I felt like I had my relevant list, and I didn't feel like there was anything else that was relevant. I mean, there's plenty of mistakes that people make, but I didn't want to. These were the ones that I thought were the most important that I had made. And so I thought, I'm just going to wrap it up here. That's okay. There's certain times when, yes, you absolutely want to conform to the format and the rules that are put in place. Maybe if you're filling out a job application, or, there's certainly things that you want to be thorough with. But then there's other times that you can say, okay, I think this is going to be fine the way it is, and just go with it. There's everybody that you talk to, Brooke, they're giving their recommendations on I do it this way. But as you both know, there's so many different ways of doing things. And especially in this industry, I do it this way, you do it that way. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. You have to decide what works for you, what works in your business, what works in your market, and go with that.
Well said.
Love that. Brooke, I think actually you have one more question to tie in Dawn's way before we do actually come to a close here.
Dawn, thanks for coming out. Great seeing you again, as always, and looking forward to seeing you at the future conferences and things like that. But yeah, if you could go back into time and give your 25-year-old self some advice, what would it be?
When I was 25, I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. I'd actually just finally gotten my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, and I knew I didn't want to work as a mechanical engineer. So I was kind of floundering, and I ended up going to nursing school, became an RN, and worked as an RN for a number of years before I finally started my own business, and I was in my mid 30s. So I would tell my 25-year-old self, find your entrepreneurial self. I was a business person, I just didn't know it. I had a lot of ideas in my head that were there when I look back on things that I wanted to do, but I didn't come from a family that had their own business. I was always pushed to get a career rather than be a business owner. And so I would tell myself that, yes, you can do it. I think some people maybe are intimidated. They don't think that they can run a big company. You think that companies are run by big, important people and not just regular people like us. But I found that not to be true. And once I, believed in myself, and I did have to believe in myself to do this. I had somebody tell me that I was silly to think that I could go into the vacation rental business. You can't make any money in this business. You're a simple little lady. You can't make any money in this business. Just, walk away and long-term rent this house. And if I had listened to that person, I wouldn't have gotten where I got. And there's been a lot of times that I've had people tell me things like that. I had an attorney tell me once that I could never sell my business. Why? How could you sell your business? You're Miss Kitty. Why would you sell your business? Nobody's going to run it the way you did. Well, I'm like, well, the reason I would sell it is because I could make a lot of money off of it. I mean, that's the thing, right? I understand it, that it's my business. It was my baby. But, there's a lot of times people will tell you advice and you shouldn't necessarily listen to it. Believe in yourself, have confidence in yourself, and give it a try, and realize that you are going to make mistakes along the way. That's why Brooke's doing this podcast and everything. You're going to make mistakes, but you can learn from those mistakes, and it teaches you who you are, and that if you pick yourself back up after making a mistake and you move forward, you're going to be all the better for it. Oh, and also what I would tell my 59-year-old self is, don't schedule a podcast on the Friday of Memorial Day, even if you only have 2 properties that you have to deal with. One was a back-to-back that we had to do repairs at, had issues at my other house. I got my guests contacting me, and I'm like, what was I thinking? Memorial Day weekend. So I'm still making mistakes and still learning.
No, that one's all on me. That one's all on me. So I'll take.
No. I had a choice of dates.
All good, Dawn. Well, we got to the end. We thank you for obviously joining us here today, and we can let you go and you can attend to the. It sounds like you're still got a little pinky maybe still in the business, as it were, with the properties that you're still retaining and working on. Even if you've been able to exit most of your body out of it, you got a little bit left in there. So that's awesome. Yeah, one thing to prevent one more mistake, Brooke, people need to do is leave a review. So go to your podcast app of choice, click 5 stars on Spotify or iTunes. That's where we get the most downloads. So we appreciate reviews there the most, and we thank you for tuning in today. We're not going to get awesome guests like Dawn to join us on a holiday weekend unless they see a lot of downloads, a lot of reviews, and they know that people are going to check it out and listen. So we thank you for your time and attention, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks so much.